Vargas. Vargas was a doctor who spent the last 7 years of his life chasing one goal, which is to kill the Count. Back when he worked as the Count's personal physician, he witnessed firsthand the horrors of his master's twisted inquisition. The Count didn't just punish so-called heretics, he devoured them. Horrified, Vargas tried to escape with his wife and kids, but they didn't make it far. They were captured and thrown into the dungeons, where Vargas was forced to watch as his family was butchered and eaten right in front of him. Then the council turned on him, mutilating his body beyond recognition. But before he could suffer the same fate, Vargas faked his death by taking a certain drug and managed to escape, also stealing the Count's beherit in the process. For the next 7 years, Vargas lived with nothing but hatred. He wanted revenge, but as a frail, broken man, he had no way to fight back. Then he met Guts. After seeing Guts take on the Count's men, he knew this was his chance. He helped Guts escape, took him in his underground hideout, and showed him the stolen beherit. He even gave him a secret route into the castle, hoping Guts would be the one to put an end to the Count's reign. Puck, seeing how much Vargas had suffered, urged him to let go of revenge and to focus on the future instead. For a brief moment, Vargas actually considered it, but before he could escape, he was captured and dragged before the public for execution. But it was nothing more than a bait to lure Guts out. Puck begged Guts to save him, but Guts coldly refused, believing it wasn't his problem. At the end, Vargas could do nothing but curse the Count with his final breath before the executioner's axe took his head. Vargas's death is one of the most painful in Berserk because it's so cruelly unfair. He had already lost everything: his family, his body, his future, yet even after all his suffering, he was treated like nothing more than a disposable pawn. He died without ever getting his revenge, and without even the dignity of a proper fight. But in the end, fate had its own sense of justice. When the Count refused to sacrifice his daughter and was dragged into the abyss, Vargas was one of the first souls to rise from the darkness and drag his murderer down with him. He may not have lived to see his revenge, but in the end, he got it. Judeau. Judeau was one of the first to join the Band of the Hawk, but before that, he was a performer in a traveling troupe. He left that life behind after running into Griffith and, like most Hawks, got swept up in the White Falcon's charisma. Judeau was always easygoing and a relatable member of the band who made people feel welcome, especially Guts, whom he helped fit in early on. When it came to Casca, Judeau was the quiet, selfless type. He had feelings for her, but rather than act on them, he supported her happiness, especially when she and Guts started growing closer. He even encouraged their relationship, even if it meant setting aside his own emotions. As a fighter, Judeau was no slouch. He wasn't the strongest, but he was quick, skilled, and had deadly accuracy with his throwing knives. Whether it was humans or apostles, if he had a target in sight, he could take them down. On top of that, he carried 2 short swords for close combat, and had solid medical knowledge, and was sharp when it came to reading situations. So he wasn't just a fighter, he was a thinker too. Then came the Eclipse, where everything fell apart. When Griffith sacrificed Hawks to achieve his dream, the apostles descended and turned the battlefield into a massacre. In the chaos, Judeau made it his mission to protect Casca. He fought alongside her, shielded her from attacks, and took brutal injuries in the process. His arm got mangled, his body torn apart, but he kept going, determined to give her a chance to survive. Even as he lay dying, Judeau tried to play it off like it was no big deal. He told Casca to go on without him, though she refused to leave him behind. In his final moments, he looked up at her, regretting just one thing: he never told her how he really felt. And just like that, he was gone. Judeau's death is one of the most painful in Berserk because of what it represents. He wasn't the strongest or the most ambitious, but he was one of the kindest and most reliable members of the Band of the Hawk. He put others before himself until the very end, and the one thing he wanted, to tell Casca how he felt, was something he never got the chance to do. His story doesn't end with glory or revenge, just quiet sacrifice and unspoken words. That's what makes it hurt the most.
And really quick, if you enjoy these no-nonsense, straight-to-the-point videos covering all sorts of anime topics, then make sure to like this video and subscribe. But anyway,
Mozgus's victims in the torture chamber. Once in Albion, Mozgus puts on his best holier-than-thou act by inviting a bunch of starving beggars into the Tower of Conviction. He quietly hands them off, all except for a mother and her dying child. He actually does take the ill baby to a doctor, which seems like an act of kindness, and when the mother thanks him, he gives her a smug little speech about how he's just following God's will. Then he drops a cryptic line about how she will have to repay this kindness later. And that's when things take a dark turn. Mozgus leads the mother, along with Vernice, Serpico, and Azan, into a chamber. The second they step in, it's clear that this isn't some holy sanctuary. This is hell on earth. The room is filled with the sound of screams and the stench of burning flesh. Mozgus's twisted disciples are hard at work, unleashing the worst kinds of torture imaginable. People are tied upside down and forcibly stretched. A man is strapped to a chair lined with spikes while getting crushed to death. An elderly man's skull is being caved in, while another poor soul is set on fire in a spinning wheel. Some are being twisted and sliced apart in ways that don't even seem physically possible. Every inch of the room is drenched in suffering. The mother is frozen in horror, but Mozgus is completely unfazed. In fact, he praises her for her courage, telling her he hopes she can endure the trials ahead. Then, he casually hands her over to the torturers, who waste no time stripping her naked and pressing scalding hot coals against her skin while she screams in agony. The people in this torture chamber suffer some of the most brutal deaths in Berserk. There was no escape, no mercy, and no reasoning with their captors. Every single one of them was put through inhuman torment, all in the name of a twisted interpretation of faith. Their suffering wasn't just physical, it was psychological, forcing them to break, body and soul, before they finally died. It was slow, excruciating, and completely devoid of hope. Truly, one of the most horrifying fates in the entire series. Holy Sea Priest. The Holy Sea's ruthless hunt for heretics in Albion didn't come without consequences. The heretics weren't just hiding in the shadows, they were striking back, and when they did, they made sure to send a loud and grisly message. One of the worst examples of this happened right around the time Mozgus was appointed to clean up Albion. One morning, the refugees living in makeshift camps outside the Tower of Conviction peeked out of their tents and were met with a sight straight out of a nightmare. Hanging from a barren tree was the flayed skin of a holy sea priest, dangling in the wind like some grotesque banner. To make things worse, a branch had been jammed through the hollowed-out remains of his head, while the tree trunk was clothed in his robe. There was no sign of the rest of the body, just skin and cloth, left there as a warning. The refugees knew exactly what this meant. It was the work of the heretics. But for them, this wasn't just a disturbing display. It was a death sentence. They knew that Mozgus would not take this lightly, and that his response would be swift, brutal, and indiscriminate. Sure enough, when he saw what had happened, he lost it. He immediately ordered the arrest of several suspicious refugees and dragged them off for interrogation, which in Mozgus's world meant horrific torture and certain death. Later, Mozgus revealed the full extent of what had happened to that poor priest. The heretics didn't just kill him, they peeled him. They stripped every inch of his skin from his body and left it behind like a discarded suit, while whatever remained of him was never found. Egg of the Perfect World. The Egg of the Perfect World is one of the strangest and most unique apostles in Berserk. Instead of the usual monstrous transformation, his apostle form made him look like a living Beherit, an eerie egg-shaped being who preferred to lurk in the shadows rather than openly wreak havoc like most apostles. His tentacle-like appendages had needles that allowed him to create pseudo-apostles, twisted beings that reflected their deepest desires in grotesque ways. He demonstrated this when he transformed the Great Goat into a monstrous pseudo-apostle, and later did the same to Mozgus and his disciples. These events set the stage for his ultimate purpose, which is to trigger the incarnation ceremony. But before he became the Egg of the Perfect World, he was just a nobody in Albion. His first memory was waking up in a trash dump beneath the Tower of Conviction, surviving off refuse and filth. One day, he found a Beherit while sifting through the garbage. Curious, he ventured up to spy on the people above, only to be met with disgust. The mere sight of him made people throw rocks and call him a monster. Rejected by the world, he fled back to his hole and spent his days living like a ghost, fishing through garbage at night and sitting in silence by day. Over time, the hole deepened, and the people above unknowingly turned it into a mass grave, dumping their dead into his home. The weight of the corpses buried him alive, as he was suffocated under the bodies of the forgotten. While on the verge of death, his Beherit activated, where he met the God Hand. With no loved ones to sacrifice, he instead offered up the entire world as it was, in exchange for the power to create a perfect world. In the latter part of the Conviction arc, when Luca got separated from Guts' group, she found herself saved by the Skull Knight, and then encountered the Egg. Instead of attacking her, the Apostle revealed his past and told her everything, not because he wanted sympathy, but because he needed someone to acknowledge that he had existed at all. That moment of vulnerability made him one of the most tragic apostles in the series. After being mortally wounded by the Skull Knight, the Egg of the Perfect World climbed to the top of the Tower of Conviction. Along the way, he found the demon child, who was also barely clinging to life after exhausting his strength to protect Casca. In an act of unexpected compassion, he swallowed the dying child and cradled it within himself. As he reached the top of the tower, his face rearranged while weeping tears of blood, and his body became a cocoon. When it cracked open, it revealed Griffith's new body, the Falcon of Light, reborn. The egg's death is one of the most painful in the series because, despite everything, he wasn't a mindless monster like most apostles. He was an outcast, a forgotten soul who wanted to shape the world into something that wouldn't reject people like him. But in the end, he realized that he was just a tool, and he gladly embraced his destiny as a stepping stone for Griffith's return. He didn't get to see his perfect world, he only got to deliver it to someone else. Collette. Collette was just an ordinary girl who had the terrible luck of crossing paths with Guts during his quest for revenge against demonkind. She and her father, Adolf, were kind-hearted travelers who offered Guts a ride on their wagon during a storm, completely unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. At first, things were peaceful. Collette even gave Guts a blanket so he wouldn't catch a cold. Later that night, Guts wakes up from a nightmare induced by an incubus, a demonic parasite that feeds on human suffering. The nightmare was basically a warning that something was coming, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Before they even had time to process what was happening, the dead began rising around them. The spirits hunting Guts possessed the corpses of fallen warriors, animating them into ghostly skeletons armed with weapons. As their horses panicked, Collette, who was completely unaware of the danger, jumped out to calm them. Guts yelled at her to get back in the wagon, but it was too late. Before she could react, a possessed skeleton warrior emerged and impaled her with a spear. She died instantly as her young body is skewered like a rag doll. Before her father can even grieve, Colette's corpse was reanimated and had become a puppet of the spirits that had killed her. In an instant, her lifeless body was used to decapitate her own father, with her soulless expression now just a tool for carnage. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, her possessed corpse lunged at Guts and attempted to stab him. Guts had no choice but to swing his sword to defend himself. In one clean motion, he bisected her completely, her upper body flying through the air before slamming onto the blood-soaked ground. And that was it. A kind, innocent girl and her father dead in seconds. Their bodies defiled and discarded like trash. Even Guts, who is no stranger to brutality, vomited in disgust before forcing himself to keep fighting the remaining skeletons until sunrise. What made Colette's death so gut-wrenching isn't just how violent it was, but how sudden and cruel it felt. She wasn't a soldier, a warrior, or a sinner. She was just a kid. She and her father wanted nothing but to help a lone traveler in the storm, and they are rewarded with a gruesome, agonizing end that completely erased their humanity. Villagers decimated by the Black Dog Knights. When the band of the Hawks rescued Griffith and escaped the Midland forces, the king ordered the Black Dog Knights to hunt them down and kill them, much to the distaste of his men who considered the Black Dogs a disgrace to the knighthood. They were led by a ruthless apostle named Wild, who was known as one of the most depraved and heartless characters in the series as a whole. In pursuit of the Hawk, Wild's group comes across a farm that previously aided the Hawks. At first, Wild inquired one of them about whether the band had passed by before, deciding to get the juices flowing a bit. The Black Dogs then violently killed the residents, even burning the children alive, and assaulted the women before dismembering them and skewering their body parts on their weapons. Although this was clearly a painful and humiliating death experienced by each of the villagers, the emotional weight makes the whole situation worse. All the villagers were guilty of was aiding a group of mercenaries in need with the Band of the Hawk, and were ruthlessly slaughtered for it. Elves of Misty Valley. These so-called elves of Misty Valley were anything but real elves. They were actually Rosine's pseudo-apostles, children who had been kidnapped, shoved into cocoons, and forcibly transformed into twisted versions of themselves. On the surface, they look a lot like real elves, but the second they felt threatened, they would mutate into grotesque insect-like monsters. These little terrors were completely loyal to Rosine, follow her every command, and had a habit of raiding villages, devouring adults, stealing kids, and forcing them into the same horrific transformation they had gone through. But the most unsettling part is that they still acted like kids. They loved playing, giggling, and goofing around. The problem was their idea of play was war, and it wasn't just pretend. As Jill and Puck watch from the sidelines in Misty Valley, the elves engage in what starts as innocent fun, but quickly turns into an absolute nightmare. They gleefully stab, dismember, and impale each other with sticks, treating real, brutal violence like a harmless game. Then comes the gut punch. Some elves excitedly present Jill with a corpse of one of their own, impaled on multiple sticks. She swats them away in disgust. As the body hits the ground, it grows and reverts back to its original human form. That's when the horrifying truth sinks in. Every single elf that dies turns back into the child they once were. Jill looks around and sees the battlefield littered with lifeless children's bodies. When Gus arrives at Misty Valley, most of these elves were slaughtered during his fight with Rosine. The few that remain perish in a massive fire that Gus set to destroy the cocoons. This is, without a doubt, one of the most horrifying deaths in the series. They weren't just monsters, they were kids, stolen from their homes, brainwashed, and turned into killers, only to die without ever realizing what had been done to them. In the end, their deaths revealed the terrible truth of what they really were: innocent children who never had a chance. Continue learning about some of the most horrific deaths in Berserk by clicking the video you see right now, and we'll see you there.